So it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Michael Norko for today's Grand Rounds. Dr. Norko is Professor of Psychiatry at Yale University School of Medicine in the Law and Psychiatry Division, Director of Forensic Services for the Connecticut Department of Mental Health and Addiction Services, editor of the Journal of the American Academy of Psychiatry and the Law, and a Distinguished Life Fellow of the American Psychiatric Association. He's a past president of the American Academy of Psychiatry and the Law and past chair of the Forensic Division of the National Association of State Mental Health Program Directors. He chairs the Psychiatry and Religion Committee of the Group for the Advancement of Psychiatry, also called GAP. Dr. Norko shared the 2013 Guttmacher Award for APA and Apple for outstanding contribution to the literature on forensic psychiatry with his co-editor Alec Buchanan for the Psychiatric Report, Principles and Practice in Forensic Writing. He's published and presented nationally and internationally on a variety of topics related to psychiatry and the law, public sector forensic psychiatry, and religion and spirituality in psychiatry. He attended the Johns Hopkins University, where he obtained his bachelor's degree in 1979, graduating Phi Beta Kappa, medical school at SUNY Upstate Medical Center, graduating in 1983, and then obtained graduate degrees in the New School for Social Research, where he obtained a postgraduate certificate in mental health administration, and he attended the Yale Divinity School, obtaining a Master of Arts in Religion in 2010. On a personal note, I was lucky to train under Dr. Norko when I was in fellowship. And in addition to being an extremely astute forensic psychiatrist, an excellent teacher, and a deep and well-rounded thinker, the quality that I felt most distinguished him was his honesty, humility, and kindness. We are indeed fortunate to have his thoughtful influence to help steer our state's mental health system into a space that recognizes the impacts and interplay of spirituality, gender, and sexual orientation as meaningful contributions to our emotional wellness. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Michael Norko.
John, thank you very much for that warm and kind introduction. Thank you all for inviting me. It's an honor and a pleasure to have this opportunity to talk to you about this work that I've been involved with for the last several years. And here we go with the moment of truth. Let's see. I think we need to put this over here. And, all right, is that all showing up properly now?
Yes.
Okay.
We're also seeing your second slide, Dr. Norko. I don't know if you wanted to.
Okay. So then I need to reverse what I just did. Okay, is that working better now?
Yes, thank you.
All right, very good. First hurdle. So this is your sign-in process and the CME disclosure information. And I do not have any disclosures to make. There's no conflicts of interest with regard to the content of this program. So I'm going to be talking about faith communities and the well-being of LGBT youth. This is the title of a publication from the Group for the Advancement of Psychiatry that was prepared by the Psychiatry and Religion Committee along with the LGBTQ Committee and published online first in September of 2020. Some of the objectives that I have for the presentation today is we're going to talk about the heightened risks that are faced by LGBT youth for various adverse outcomes, including mental health, substance use, and others. We're going to talk about ways in which families and faith communities together can help reduce these risks of adverse consequences and provide some of the literature that supports these recommendations, and hopefully provide a sense of how healthcare providers might be able to work with faith leaders and faith communities to improve the well-being of LGBT youth in their communities. So first, a little history of how this project got started. Several years ago, a friend of mine was discussing the problem of suicides among LGBTQ youth with his local bishop. The bishop was concerned that the press was reporting this rise in suicides and expressed the fact that he and his fellow bishops were looking for something that they might be able to do to help with this problem. And the bishop asked specifically whether there were any publications from mental health experts that might address this. My friend got in touch with me. I was not aware that there were any such documents available. I got in touch with Mary Barber, who's a psychiatrist, member of GAP, who was previous chair of the GAP LGBT committee. And we talked about it, and she put me in touch with a researcher from the San Francisco State University, Caitlin Ryan, and her Family Acceptance Project. And that started a collaboration of several years between Mary, the LGBT committee, our committee in psychiatry and religion, and Caitlin Ryan, working to try to develop something that might be useful along these lines. The result was this publication, which is online at the GAP homepage, ourgap.org. There's a revision that we've made this past fall to allow it to be printed more easily, and hopefully within the next week or so, the new version will also be the version that appears on ourgap.org. The document was picked up by people in Finland who got in touch with us and wanted to translate it into Finnish and Swedish and publish it. And that has now occurred. And it's been published by the Evangelical Lutheran Church of Finland. They've used pictures that were relevant to their country, and they've added resources that were appropriate to what was available locally for them. In March of 2021, the American Psychiatric Association commended the publication for its contribution to the well-being of LGBT youth. So now I'm going to go through the booklet pretty much in describing what's known about this area, and this is the structure of the booklet. So I'm also, in describing the information to you, I'm also going to give you a sense of what the booklet looks like. Paula told me that she was going to send you all a PDF of the booklet, so hopefully you have that or will have it soon, and you can look through it yourself. But the overview begins with this sort of introduction, trying to tell people in faith communities that religion and medicine share a common interest in the welfare of young people. And we actually share several important societal functions, many of which relate to how we care for one another. In both settings, we deal with suffering, despair, death, and try to facilitate hope, meaning, and purpose. In both religion and medicine, we look to alleviate pain and address difficult aspects of life to hopefully enhance well-being in a variety of dimensions. Faith communities are known for assuming leadership in fostering love of neighbor, justice, care for the earth and creation, and the dignity of all human life. And medicine continues to investigate and address human needs in order to enhance human flourishing. So ideally, both the congregation and the clinic could be understood as places of healing. Now, on the topic of LGBT youth, they face multiple mental health challenges, including suicide, depression, anxiety, substance abuse, bullying, and homelessness. And now I'm going to present some of the data for this. We present much of this data in the booklet in a form that's hopefully approachable for people who are not healthcare professionals. A few of the slides that I'll present are not in the booklet, and I'll point those out as we go along. The CDC reported on the Youth Risk Behavior Survey, which looked at reports from 2007 to 2017, and noted that LGBTQ youth are twice as likely to be bullied or use illicit drugs, more than twice as likely to feel persistently sad or hopeless, more than 3 times as likely to inject illegal drugs and consider suicide or make a suicide plan, and more than 4 times as likely to attempt suicide. In a study by Raifman and colleagues, they were looking at sexual minority youth and noted that several things. One is that the proportion of adolescents who report a minority sexual orientation nearly doubled between 2019 and 2017, from 7.3% to 14.3%. And this is probably related to people's increasing comfort and some increased acceptance in society, and people's willingness to reveal their minority sexual orientation. Still, however, in 2017, sexual minority youth were 3.8 times more likely to attempt suicide compared to heterosexual youth. Now, the somewhat good news in there is that that odds ratio was 5.2 in 2009, so there was some improvement there. And the percentage of sexually minority youth who had suicide attempts actually declined somewhat from 26.7% in 2009 to 20.1% in 2017. Still, however, among all adolescents who attempted suicide, an increasing proportion are SMY, from 24.6% in 2009 to 39.93% in 2017, which is a fairly large increase. In a report about transgender youth, suicide thoughts occurred 2 to 4 times higher rate than in non-transgender peers. Suicide attempts 3 to 6 times higher rate, and the experience of physical and sexual assault also 2 to 3 times higher rate. In terms of bullying and suicide, among the youth ages 10 to 19 who died by suicide from 2003 to 2017, LGBT youth were 5 times more likely to have been bullied than their non-LGBT peers, 20.7% compared to 4.4%. And the age range that was most susceptible to this is the 10 to 13-year-old age range, where you can see the dramatic difference in terms of the LGBT versus non-LGBT people who died by suicide, in terms of having been bullied, with over 2/3 of the LGBT youth who died by suicide having been bullied. In terms of substance use, a meta-analysis from 2008 of 18 studies from 1995 to 2006 regarding tobacco, alcohol, and illicit drugs showed that on average, LGB youth had 190% higher use of substances than heterosexual peers, an odds ratio of 2.89. And in this study, it was only LGB. There was not data about transgender youth. Bisexual youth were even higher, with a 340% higher risk, and female LGB youth were at the highest risk of 400% higher risk. In a SAMHSA report from 2020 about LGBTQ youth homelessness, 40% of homeless youth identified as LGBTQ, compared to 5 to 10% of the general population identifying that way. In New York City, one of the few places where there's good data about this, the average age of homelessness for gay and lesbian youth was 14.4 years, and younger for transgender youth at 13.5. 43% of the LGBT youth who became homeless said that they became homeless when their parents forced them out of their home because of their sexual orientation or gender identity. And nearly a third reported having been abused physically, emotionally, or sexually at home. This is a slide that's not in the booklet, but I think is relevant to our discussion today. And it was a study about gay-straight alliance groups in high schools. And it turns out that the presence of a gay-straight alliance was associated with better young adult well-being and more college-level education attainment. And interestingly, the presence of the GSA was actually more closely associated with these positive effects than was participation in the GSA. And the authors theorized that the effect may well be related to the fact that the mere presence of a GSA in a high school creates a context of acceptance, which relieves stress for the LGBT youth. Another finding was that participation buffered the effects of LGBT victimization on depression and suicide, but only for low levels of victimization. When victimization levels were high, the presence or participation in GSA did not mitigate that effect at all. And the perceived effectiveness, which was another thing that they studied of the GSA, was positively associated with college education attainment and negatively associated with depression and substance abuse. We did not include the Trevor Project data in our booklet. The first Trevor Project survey report was in 2019, and we had already submitted the booklet for consideration by the GAP Publication Board at that time. I'm hoping to be able to revise the booklet in the next couple of months, and we'll be including some of this data. Now, the Trevor Project is an American nonprofit organization founded in 1998, focused on suicide prevention for LGBTQ youth. The 2021 survey represents the experience of nearly 35,000 LGBTQ youth between the ages of 13 and 24 across the United States. There was a somewhat larger N in the 2020 survey of 40,000, but the third survey was the most diverse, with 45% of those who responded being youth of color and 38% being transgender or non-binary. And here are some of the survey results. 42% of LGBTQ youth seriously considered attempting suicide in the past year, and that was more than half of the transgender and non-binary youth. 12% of white youth attempted suicide compared to 31% of Native or Indigenous youth, 21% of Black youth, 21% of multiracial youth, 18% Latinx, and 12% Asian Pacific Islanders. So there's a level of granularity in this data that's also helpful to understand the particular risks of subpopulations of LGBT youth. 48% of the LGBTQ youth reported that they wanted counseling from a mental health professional, but were unable to receive it in the past year. Now, the Trevor Project doesn't report on why the youth were not able to receive it, so we don't have that information. So all we can do is speculate about that. Some of the results related to COVID-19 are very interesting. More than 80% of the youth who responded said that COVID-19 made their living situation more stressful, and only 1 in 3 found that their home was LGBTQ affirming. So imagine that 2/3 of LGBT youth are largely confined to their homes during COVID, and it's a place where their identity and their orientation are not affirmed, and they have little opportunity to go places where they can find support and affirmation. 70% of them said that their mental health was poor most of the time or always during COVID-19. 72% reported symptoms of generalized anxiety disorder in the last 2 weeks, and that was more than 75% for the transgender and non-binary youth. That was up from 68% in the 2020 survey, and may well reflect the ongoing stress of isolation during COVID. 62% reported symptoms of major depressive disorder in the past 2 weeks, and for transgender and non-binary youth, that was more than 66%. That was also an increase from the 2020 survey. 94% of the youth who responded said that recent politics negatively impacted their mental health, and that was an increase from 86% in the 2020 survey. So that's nearly a universal reaction from this population of young people. And 75% of LGBTQ youth reported that they had experienced discrimination based on their orientation or identity at least once in their lifetime. Some of the sources of discrimination and minority stress that we do cover in the booklet and tell people about is, for example, growing up in a community where it is acceptable to make anti-gay statements, or where it's not safe to live openly as a transitioning person or as a same-sex couple, or where laws discriminate against LGBTQ persons. For example, in the Youth Risk Behavior School Survey, they found that LGBT youth who lived in states without marriage equality had higher rates of suicide attempts than those in states with marriage equality. And these are all high school students. So their ability to get married is not really an issue for most of them at this point. And this is one of those examples of the political and social context being very important to the well-being of LGBT youth. Other sources of minority stress include not being allowed to marry within one's faith, not being able to be open in one's faith community, and family not recognizing or welcoming a young adult's same-sex partner. Then we proceed to tell people what we know about the ways that it's possible to reduce these outcomes. And parents have a large part to play in this and can reduce these negative health outcomes by engaging behaviors that show that they love their child, even if their faith does not allow them to embrace the child's identity or orientation. We tell people that parents may feel uncomfortable and still be able to help their LGBT children. And even if they feel conflicted between their faith and their child's sexual orientation, they don't have to choose between them in order to instill hope in their child and help them toward a better future. And we try to emphasize that faith communities can be helpful with this process. Now, in the next several slides, I'm going to be showing you some of the findings from the Family Acceptance Project. And so I'm just putting up here some of the peer-reviewed publications from that group that form the basis for what you're about to see in the next slides. Now, I should also mention that the methodology that informs the next slides, this was decades of research, and it was very intensive interview data with families and LGBT young people, in which they asked about family dynamics, they asked about behaviors in the home, they asked about the relevant outcomes for the LGBT young people, and in the end, they wound up identifying 50 behaviors that were harmful to LGBT youth and 50 behaviors that were helpful to LGBT youth. And that laid a foundation for the harm reduction model that the Family Acceptance Project promotes and that we also advise in the booklet. So here are some slides now on what the effects of family rejection are. One of the things that they discovered was that this is not an all or nothing phenomenon, that there are levels of rejection and that there are levels of acceptance. And those are based on how many of the rejecting and accepting behaviors the family engages in toward the young person. So by doing that, they were able to kind of stratify high rejection families versus low rejection families and see what the differential effects are. In terms of lifetime suicide attempts, families with high rejection had an 857% increase in the level of suicide attempts. There was a 629% increase in depression for the young people in families with high rejection compared to those with low rejection. Similarly, with illegal drug use, a 328% increase for high rejecting families versus low rejecting families. So we present that data and then move into the second part of the booklet where we start addressing how faith communities can be helpful. We note that faith traditions vary in their teaching about sexual orientation and same-sex marriage. Some are accepting and some are not. But we note that no faith tradition wants to intentionally harm its young people or discourage them from remaining within their faith tradition. So we try to strike a note of understanding with people and understanding the conflict that they face between their desire to raise healthy and happy children and their faith beliefs. And we note that that will lead to some tensions when deeply held principles collide. But faith traditions don't need to abandon their doctrines in order to contribute to more positive health and mental health outcomes for their LGBTQ youth. And again, this is data and slides from Caitlin Ryan, the Family Acceptance Project. One of the things that they promote is when you look at the opposite side of the rejecting and look at the accepting behaviors, what we find is that in families with high levels of accepting and supportive behaviors compared to those that have no or low levels of accepting behaviors, the youth have better overall health. They're less likely to be depressed, 3 times less likely to think about suicide or to attempt suicide, less likely to have substance use problems, have higher self-esteem, experience more social support, and have better family relationships. When you ask the youth whether they believe that they can be a happy LGBT adult, for those who come from families that are not at all accepting, only about 1/3 of them believe they can be happy. But that goes all the way up to 92% for families in which the acceptance is high. So then we start in on a section about counseling families about what the behaviors are that they should avoid and what the behaviors are that can be helpful. And we note that they can use the booklet in their congregation as a starting point for dialogue and inquiry and encourage them to take advantage of what it means to live in a community. So these are examples of behaviors that are helpful that we note in the booklet: talking with your child about their LGBT identity, expressing affection when you learn of your child's identity, supporting your child's identity even if you feel uncomfortable, requiring that other family members respect your LGBT child, working to make your congregation supportive of LGBT members, and believing that your child can have a happy future as an LGBT adult. Now, the Family Acceptance Project has developed posters. I noted, remember that there were 50 accepting behaviors that they've noted, and they've put into their posters a large number of these. You can order these, you can download them. They're available at the website that I've included there in the middle. And they've actually produced 2 different versions of it. The one on the right is for, well, the one on the left is for more conservative settings, and the one on the right they refer to as more general settings, and they've changed the items that are in the posters based on that. So there are some things that they think that folks in a more conservative setting might not wish to do. And if I come up really close to these, I can say, for example, they're circled in red there: speak up when others make negative comments about LGBTQ people, and volunteer with organizations that support LGBTQ people. The Trevor Project also has findings that are related to support. Transgender and non-binary youth who reported that pronouns were respected by the people they lived with attempted suicide at half the rate of those who did not have their pronouns respected by anyone with whom they lived. Transgender and non-binary youth who were able to change their name or their gender on legal documents reported lower rates of attempting suicide. And those who had access to spaces that affirmed their sexual orientation and gender identity also reported lower rates of attempted suicide. But remember that only 1 in 3 LGBTQ youth found their homes to be LGBTQ affirming. So this seems like a natural place for us to concentrate harm reduction efforts. Now, behaviors that are harmful, hitting, physically hurting, or verbally harassing your child because of their identity, excluding them from family events and activities, blaming the child when they're mistreated or discriminated against because of their identity, telling the child that God will punish them because they are gay or transgender, telling the child that the parent is ashamed of them, or making the child keep their LGBT identity a secret. And similarly, the Family Acceptance Project has posters of rejecting behaviors, and these are available at the same place. And their hope is that people would download these posters and put them up in schools and community centers, in faith communities, in healthcare clinics, anywhere in which they might be useful for people seeing them. So then we try to give some messaging to parents, recognizing that not everyone is going to find it easy to hear from their child about their identity or their orientation, and telling them that if they're having a hard time managing their own reaction to learning about their child's orientation or identity, they may need someone to talk to about it, whether that's a peer, whether that's someone from their faith community, whether that's a healthcare professional, whatever. Also, that they should be honest with themselves about their emotions and their own needs, and not blame themselves about that. But at the same time, making sure that the child is assured of their love in both words and actions. They shouldn't stop doing things together that they enjoy and that have defined them as a family, including attending religious services. You know, when we were picking out stock photos to include in the booklet, we were looking for pictures of families engaged in activities like going for hikes and playing games in the park and cooking together, and whatever it is, to try to visually represent this idea. And finally, to be open to listening when the child wants to talk, and telling parents that they don't need to have all the answers, that they just have to be there for them. In many ways, dealing with this is not that different from dealing with all of the other difficult aspects of being a parent. I mean, no one gets handed a how-to manual when they have children, and parents face lots of experiences that they've never had to encounter before. And what they need to do in this situation is the same as what they need to do in other situations, which is talk to people, talk to their family, talk to friends, read about it, think about it. But mostly they just have to be there for their children. We try to point out to people that good parenting always involves sacrifice, as does living well in community with others, and that faith traditions tend to understand this, And again, emphasizing that this is not that different a concept from what people understand from their participation in their social setting. And that finding ways to love and support children and help them achieve lives of hopefulness and helpfulness is an important part of living in community. And that the conflicts that will arise should be conversation starters, not conversation enders, but always have to be expressed along with the clear message that the adults of the community love and respect the young LGBT person. Then we move into part 3 of the booklet, where we talk about common ground between faith and medicine. In their own ways, each aims to enhance human flourishing. We have different ways of doing this, different practices, different accomplishments, but the opportunity exists for both to complement each other and through dialogue and collaboration lead to enhancement of their shared aspirations. The ability to support LGBT youth in our homes, our faith communities, our schools and healthcare settings is only enhanced when we have collaborations between medicine and faith. Then there's resources that people should be aware of. If you haven't seen this, I recommend that you all Google this and download it. In 2018, the American Psychiatric Association Foundation, along with a partnership, published a book about mental health, a guide for faith leaders. There's a booklet, and then there's a kind of a short cheat sheet, the kind of thing you'd put in the top drawer of your desk if you were a clergy person, for example. And it explains a variety of mental health diagnoses and problems that they might encounter and how they should think about them and handle them and where they can get help with that. So that's also a very good thing. If you're going to engage in collaborations with faith leaders, with members of faith communities, that's a good thing to have and to share with people. The Family Acceptance Project has all sorts of booklets, posters, videos, and articles from professional journals. It's an excellent website, something that's worth looking at and worth sharing with other people. And I've listed the website there. SAMHSA also has a helpful publication called the Practitioner's Resource Guide, helping families to support their LGBT children. And that's worth taking a look at. And then, of course, there are a variety of organizations. I've just listed a few of them here. There are more in the booklet. We sort of start closing the booklet with an invitation to faith communities to communicate with their local mental health and health providers, to try to engage in these dialogues to improve the health and well-being of LGBT youth. And we invite them to communicate with us about any areas where they see perhaps needs for improvement of the booklet itself, or suggestions for things we could add, or examples of programs and activities that they've created or encountered that they found useful, and perhaps we might include in a future edition as something that was helpful. Throughout the booklet, all of the data that we put in the booklet is footnoted, so that if people want to look up the primary source of the information, they can. And at the end of the booklet, we have a bibliography that includes 38 references, as well as other kinds of resources. And we encourage people that some members of their community who are healthcare providers may be interested, as well as others, in looking further at the information in order to help in their communities and to learn more about how to be protective of the well-being of their LGBTQ youth. There are a few resources that I'll highlight in particular here. The Family Acceptance Project has family education booklets, and these have been designated as best practices for suicide prevention on the best practices registry. There's a general publication, and these are relatively short booklets, little pamphlets style booklets. There's a general one, and there's one that was addressed specifically to members of the Church of Latter-day Saints, the Mormons, that was co-authored with the then president of the local Mormon church that they worked with on this, which is a very interesting approach, because the Mormon church does not teach acceptance of same-sex marriage, but has a very profound tradition of caring about their young people and their well-being. Taking a look at that booklet is a clear example of how a faith tradition doesn't have to give up its doctrinal beliefs in order to try to be helpful to the well-being of their young people. That is also well represented in the video, Families Are Forever. That's also available from the Family Acceptance Project. This is a 21-minute video about a Mormon family who are grappling with their young teenage son who comes out to them as gay, and how they struggled with that and how they worked through it and coped with it. They don't tell you the answer, which I think is appropriate, because a lot of this is about the working through rather than having a clear answer. But it's a very moving and powerful video, and if you have an opportunity to work with a faith community or any community about this issue, this would be something that I'd highly recommend as a conversation starter. As I said, it's 21 minutes. It's very powerful, and it leads very easily into discussion. I think anyone probably attending this grand rounds would find it relatively easy to facilitate a discussion from this. But there is also material available from the Family Acceptance Project. There's a kind of a resource guide that goes along with the video, a discussion guide for people who might not be as adept at working in groups and facilitating discussion. It's well worth looking into. CachetteOnline.org is an organization that promotes the equality of LGBTQ Jews. Cachette is the Hebrew word for rainbow. So that's another organization and another faith tradition that's worth taking a look at. James Martin's fairly famous book, Building a Bridge, How the Catholic Church and the LGBT Community Can Enter into a Relationship of Respect, Compassion, and Sensitivity, is also a very excellent resource. The bottom one there from Ken Wilson is an evangelical pastor who's written a book along the same lines about how to embrace LGBT people within an evangelical community. And Dr. Ryan has also written an article in the Washington Post talking about how parents don't have to choose between their faith and their LGBT kids. So that brings me to the conclusion of telling you about the booklet and the resources available. And I'd be happy to entertain any questions that you have at this time.
Thank you very much, Dr. Norko. I'm going to be facilitating the discussion, so if anyone has any questions, you could either put them in the chat or raise your hand. I'll try to call on you. I actually could get this started. I'm interested in how sort of elegant this notion is in its simplicity, like just how like this just makes so much common sense to me that this is the way that we should be embracing our LGBTQ youth, and the way we should be facilitating this discussion, and how in contrast it is to what is happening in our country and in specifically in political discourse. And I'm just wondering if you have any guidance about the role psychiatry should play in changing the conversation from one of conflict to one of collaboration, between, you know, religion versus sexual orientation,
Yeah.
and how they can coexist.
Right. So let me just say a little something about one of our colleagues who helped write the booklet, who I mentioned earlier, Mary Barber. Mary is a psychiatrist who for many years worked in public psychiatry in the New York Office of Mental Health, and several years ago decided to go to divinity school. This last fall, she was ordained an Episcopal priest. So, and she's now the pastor of two parishes in New York. So I think she brought her her natural desires and interests as a psychiatrist about relationships and helping people to a different dimension, and pursued that in a way that made sense to her, and embraced the relationship between, you know, what in the literature in the past has been called the relationship between couch and cloth. And you know, there are tensions there. There's no question about that. There's a significant portion, for example, of the LGBTQ community who are hesitant to think about approaching faith traditions as a way of helping their cause, because many of them have been hurt by their faith traditions, and they're very wary about that. But that's what we were trying to address in putting this booklet together. I'm hoping that people can use it as a way of approaching their faith communities, the leaders in their faith communities, to open dialogue about it. You know, one of the things, this relies heavily on 30 plus years of research that Caitlin Ryan has done, and you know what she learned about the fact that you can't address this concern head on. You can't say, no, I'm sorry, you think wrong about this, or you believe wrong about this. That just gets nowhere, and it doesn't help anyone. But allowing people to you know, what the approach that she tries to emphasize in their work, and she does a lot of trainings around the country in addition to her ongoing research. And one of the principles that she tries to use is that she doesn't want to engage the discussion at the level of dogma or belief. She wants to engage the discussion at a deeper level of underlying values, right? So the underlying value of love, of compassion, of caring for young people and wanting to raise them to be healthy and happy members of the community is a foundation of faith communities, regardless of what their doctrinal ideas are. So that's the level at which she approaches it, and I think it's possible to have this discussion. It's not tension free, and how people will work that out will be up to them. You know, as I said, the Families Are Forever video doesn't end with telling us how the family dealt with their doctrinal beliefs, but it very clearly tells you how the family loved their son and made every effort they could to be supportive of their son. So, you know, I think that's the message. I hope that that answers your question, John.
It did. Thank you. Dr. Schwartz? You got to unmute yourself.
Hello, Mike. Dr.
Hey,
Norko, good to see you, and thank
Good.
you for this excellent presentation. So I find myself thinking of that, what was it, 33% of kids who wind up actually being homeless because their families simply can't, you know, accept them, and thinking more about the kids who are kind of caught in the middle between complete estrangement and still hoping and trying to, still wishing for a reconciliation and a place within their families. Those kids and the kids all the way out to complete estrangement, for whom none of this, you know, will work, because for those families and perhaps those particular churches or faith communities, acceptance is just a step too far. You know, what approach do you recommend to the kids who simply will not be able to achieve acceptance within their families or their church?
Yeah. So while that's, you know, a very important part of well-being, it's not necessarily the only way to experience support and acceptance. And often people have to find that in other places. So whether that's with friends, with organizations, finding a different faith community, if that makes sense for some people, or just finding a community, whether it's related to faith or not, that in which they can experience support is helpful. You know, all of the data about social context tells us that how important it is to be in an environment where people are free to be who they are and express who they are, and at least be accepted by other people. So, you know, it may mean finding a community where that's possible. Remember the friend that I mentioned to you at the beginning, who got this whole project started by his conversations with the bishop. His son works at a shelter in New York City for LGBT youth who are homeless, the vast majority of whom have been kicked out because of their family's inability to accept them. But they find a supportive environment within the context of that shelter and its related support system. So it's not just the physical environment of the place to sleep, but all of the social supports and relationships that can develop in a place like that. So, you know, I think we have to do that as well. This is, you know, there's clearly not there's no silver bullet to this. Not all families are going to be open to working along these lines. I think maybe some of the people who are in the moderate rejecting range, maybe who bring their children to mental health professionals, perhaps some of them, you know, might be open to this, at least if it's presented in a way in which it doesn't threaten their doctrinal beliefs that they hold very firmly, but tries to help them understand that there are things that they can do and that it's not an all or nothing approach, and that every one rejecting behavior that they engage in less, and every accepting behavior that they engage in more has some incremental effect. So I think there's a variety of things that we need to do, including creating structures for the kids who have really had it bad in terms of where they grew up.
Dr. Weiss?
Yes, hi, thank you so much. I'm an adult psychiatrist here at Institute of Living. So thank you for giving this talk. It's wonderful. I found it very, very valuable, both for our adult outpatients who struggle with their kids and just to understand better. We do have a unique population. I was thinking about two different topics, and I don't have a fully formed question, but we do have a lot of Jehovah's Witnesses in our adult clinic. And I was wondering if you had anything specific for that population. And then on the flip side, also, I feel like I know the United Church of Christ, or the congregational churches, they're putting big rainbow flags out in front of their churches. So has that had an impact, or is, do you have any data on either,
Right. Yeah, I've not seen any data specific to whether or not people live in a community with United Church of Christ congregation. They obviously have been very outspoken about their support. Every one of their churches that you pass has some sort of affirming message on the outside of the church. And then, of course, we know that there are other churches that are not at all supportive. I mean, just in the last couple of weeks, we've had the Milwaukee Diocese of the Roman Catholic Church put out a transgender policy that was absolutely rejecting and very difficult for people to live with, which has prompted reaction from within the Catholic Church as well. Father James Keenan, who's a professor at Boston College, wrote an article that doesn't explicitly mention the Milwaukee. Well, actually, it does. I take that back. But responds to that by talking about how 20 years ago, a psychologist got in touch with him because a number of the psychologist's clients were LGBT. In particular, at the time, the issue was transgender, and they actually wanted to talk to a priest because they were Catholic, and they wanted to talk to a priest. And the psychologist asked around, and people told them that maybe to refer to Father Keenan. And so he did that, and Father Keenan wound up speaking to a number of the clients. And he writes about, he wrote just this past week in the National Catholic Reporter, wrote an article about how that was transformative for him to listen to the stories of transgender people and their life experience, and how highly he recommended it for other people. So there are these islands of hope, these islands of acceptance. Father James Martin writes about building a bridge, right? And this idea of trying to connect in some way. He doesn't write about necessarily saying that the church has to drop all of its doctrines, even if he maybe believes that personally. But his writing is about, again, it's really the same approach that Dr. Ryan takes, which is he goes deeper to the underlying values of compassion and love, and tries to emphasize that part of his faith tradition's teaching, and emphasize that. So no, I don't know about any particular studies of one religious group or another. The Family Acceptance Project is currently developing a Catholic-specific pamphlet, and they are currently developing an evangelical-specific booklet. So it'll be good when those come out. One of the things that people have talked about in the literature in this area for a number of years is how important it would be just to have some of the more vocal faith communities even just tone down the rhetoric, because of how influential it can be when people hear the negative comments. And again, it's you know, this harm reduction, this incremental approach. So you know, I don't know that we're going to. There is some I'm forgetting his name, but one of the Catholic cardinals in Germany is now actually proposing that the Catholic Church, for example, needs to take a hard look at its doctrine and needs to examine the medical and scientific data about LGBT people and reformulate its thinking. So, you know, there are people who are approaching this, but what we do know is that the more acceptance there is in a social context, the better people feel, even to the extent of the very clear data about states with that allow same-sex marriage. And this was before the federal decision. So at a time when the states entirely controlled this, that whether or not it was you were in a position of wanting to get married or not, living in a state that allowed it was something that significantly added to well-being for LGBT people.
And anything on the second item, which was maybe the Jehovah's Witness?
Oh, yeah, I don't. One of the resources in the booklet is an online source for looking up how any given faith tradition expresses doctrinal views or not about same-sex marriage and that sort of thing. I'm not familiar with any specific work with Jehovah's Witnesses, and I don't know that I've seen any literature about that group. You know, one of the problems is that they don't form a large percentage of the population, and so it is hard to have a subgroup of people to study.
Dr. Coratola?
Hi there. I thank you so much for the presentation, this information, and the booklet that you sent along with this. It's very helpful. I was just curious if you have any understanding of the kind of interface between PFLAG and other faith-based communities, if they work collaboratively, if they support each other.
So there are a variety of faith-based communities, and then there are secular organizations. So PFLAG and Human Rights Campaign are more secular oriented. There are other groups that are more specific to various faith traditions. We have the resources for some of those in the booklet. I want to add more of them in the next edition of it. I've sent the booklet to about 30 of those. Unfortunately, didn't hear back from more than one or two of them. So I don't know what that means. But there still is a fair amount, as I mentioned before. There's a fair amount of wariness between LGBT advocacy groups and faith groups in many faith traditions, and some not at all. So as we mentioned, the United Church of Christ obviously is very welcoming. Many portions of the Episcopal Church are very welcoming. So there are pockets, and but there's that I know of. There are not a lot of, and then there are pockets of within faith traditions. There are also groups that oppose any form of acceptance or gay rights, and just work to confirm traditional beliefs and try to tell people that they should go for conversion therapy, or they should pray more. You know, all of the things that that we know are the rejecting behaviors that hurt people. So I'm not aware of a lot of interaction. There are clearly people, you know, I know a lot of people who, in my tradition, I'm a Catholic. I know a lot of people who are LGBT who are Catholic. I know people who are LGBT and former Catholics, people who have found ways to be comfortable within the church, and others who just can't tolerate it. You know, when I was a resident in New York City at St. Vincent's down in Greenwich Village, we attended, my wife and I attended St. Francis Xavier Church, which was a very LGBT affirming parish, which subsequently most of its affirming activities got shut down by the Cardinal right about the time that we left New York. So, but they've remained positive throughout. So there are church groups. There's a Catholic group called New Ways Ministry, which has been an advocate for LGBT persons for probably 30 years. Founded by a nun and a priest, and they remain very active to this day. So I don't know. You know, I've not seen specific interactions between the church groups and the secular groups, but many of the supportive church groups have very similar messages to the secular support groups.
We have a question in the chat. Any collaborators or active partners from the Muslim community in the US?
I know that I've seen some articles about Muslim activity in this area, and I did locate, although I won't be able to remember the name of the organization, but I did identify one Muslim group that was pro-LGBT. If I can try to refine that and get that information, maybe I'll send it to Paula. Would that work?
Yeah, that I think would be good. I actually had a follow-up question, Dr. Norko. I'm wondering about whether the discussion ever gets to the idea of like choice in sexuality, because we know that like traditionally like conversion therapy has been under a religious sort of justification, that religious organizations believe that you were choosing to do this and therefore could choose not to be a particular orientation. And I'm just wondering whether or not you feel like there's any work to be done in terms of describing sexuality not as a choice, but as a sort of innate part of our identity that we don't necessarily choose.
Yeah, you know, I certainly have been involved with some church activities in which those discussions have taken place. I don't think that they're possible at a hierarchical level. So, for example, I don't think that, the American Psychiatric Association could take on the Vatican and achieve some sort of result in that dimension. But I think at the individual level, at the local level, is where it's more likely to force people to encounter that concern, right? So, when I watch the video of the Mormon family, you can see them struggling with the tension about their doctrinal beliefs and their uncompromising love for their son. And in the end, they come down on the side of their son, but they don't give up their participation and their life in the Mormon church. So, and they don't tell you how they individually coped with that tension. What did it make them think or question about their doctrines? And I think the same thing would occur in other faith traditions that hold strong doctrinal beliefs that homosexuality is wrong. But at the individual level, people will have to grapple with that and come to their own individual decision in conscience formation about how to deal with that. And that will be easier for some people than others. Those of you familiar with Fowler's stages of faith work, there are people who never progress out of a stage where they simply accept doctrinal beliefs and they have a simplistic way of understanding them, and it makes them feel comfortable to know that there are confirmed or rigid truths, and that's all they need to know. And then there are other people who come to see, well, other traditions believe other things, and there may be other ways of coming to know the truth, and there may be other ways to coming to forms of spiritual enlightenment. And for those people, obviously, it would be much easier for them to question doctrine and to try to come to some understanding of their own faith tradition that also allowed them to be the loving parent that they want to be.
We have 2 minutes left. Any last comments or questions?
Quick question. Can you speak, Dr. Norko, and thank you for the talk, can you speak to transferential reactions you have and how you contend with them when you're doing this work?
I think we all rely on our listening skills. We don't necessarily have to agree with faith leaders. We don't have to agree with what our patients believe. Our job is to maybe try to understand that a little better and express interest in it, to demonstrate respect for other people, and particularly to work on doing that with people with whom we have strong disagreements. But I think the task is to try to help the other person to find the source of their underlying values, and to try to live according to those, because there really aren't, we obviously have some antisocial people in society, but we typically don't have people from faith traditions who are advocating a desire to harm other people, and particularly not their own. So I think it's not too different from working in other settings with other kinds of issues at play.
All right. It is 1:15. I just want to say thank you very much again, Dr. Norko. This was a wonderful talk and discussion. And we're very lucky to have you here.
Well, I appreciate your offering the opportunity for me to talk about this work, and all of you for being with us today.
Right.